Hello, so in today's training video we're going to be looking at property strategies and something called lease to let, and how lease to let can work for you really as a purely kind of cash flow strategy. Now it's more recently a strategy that's come about and become more popular in the mainstream with investors in around sort of 2013. Um, this was in terms of being on forums a little bit more, and in terms of being also in the main kind of press as well. But as a property strategy, we've been kind of using it since about 2011, and the first property that we did using this strategy was in an area called Chester in the northwest. And it's a strategy really that kind of takes its principle from managing a property as a HMO, where you would effectively take over a property from a tired landlord, and then you would manage it and rent it out as roomlets or as a HMO. So you would pay the landlord a set monthly fee as a lease agreement, or even a management agreement, depending on how you wanted to structure it. And then you take on the property yourselves, and you're in effect the letting agent or the managing agent for the property. But with this, you also take on the cost of potential void periods, rent arrears, the internal maintenance costs. So you're really underwriting the potential risk of that property to an extent. So for the landlord, what they get out of the deal is that they get their property now earning kind of regular fixed monthly income without having the hassle of having to kind of manage the property themselves and having to deal with the day-to-day kind of requirements of being a landlord almost. And you're taking on effectively or running the property like kind of like a business. So you're getting the property without any large deposits. You're not having to buy the property up front. You can simply run it as a cash flow and an income strategy simply by managing the property effectively and renting out the individual rooms, as we mentioned. Now, this isn't a strategy that you should just jump straight into if you're new to property and you're a complete beginner. There's a lot of people out there that recommend kind of this as a fantastic strategy and kind of the be all and end all to getting involved in property. And although it can be great for cash flow, there are certain elements you need to kind of consider, and certainly if you're brand new to property, there's a lot of areas that you do need to consider before you kind of jump straight into this really. So it's just a case of proceeding with a little bit of caution. So for a start, when it comes to kind of managing these types of properties, you're only really going to be successful if you're effective at kind of managing tenants. If you're good with people skills, that could be a background in terms of managing your own tenants or managing tenants for other landlords, and that's certainly a distinct advantage. But you do need kind of some experience of dealing with people because it's going to be a hands-on sort of role really. It also can be a bit of a legal minefield when it comes to the agreements that you use, whether you kind of sublet the property or whether you use lease agreements to set up the structure. And that's because these types of agreements aren't really commonplace in the UK residential property market. So there's no kind of common law necessarily that backs up a particular kind of structure of the setup. So it's important to get a solicitor that draws out a proper lease agreement and management agreement. It takes into account all the different kind of elements that are going to be involved in your particular deal, instead of simply kind of trying to, I suppose, hash an agreement off the internet, or try and kind of create your own based on a couple of different type of agreements and try and kind of make one hybrid almost. You want to make sure that yourself and also the landlord are covered, so that you're setting up right from the beginning, so that you can run it as a proper business and it's going to be long term, because you're going to be hanged on managing the tenants. You don't want to have all the hassles as well on the side. But saying that, that might kind of sound a bit doom and gloom, and it's not really the case. As I said, it can be a fantastic strategy, but it is important that you set up right from the beginning in terms of understanding where the pitfalls lie and understanding really how to use it correctly long term. Now, this is a great strategy, as I mentioned, for cash flow, but what it doesn't do is build your property portfolio. Now, the properties that work best on this particular strategy are ones that have really already been set up and used as a HMO previously. So they already require, also they already adhere to the requirements of the council regulations. They've already set up kind of to operate as a fully functioning HMO. Also, ideally where the property is unencumbered, so it doesn't have any mortgage or anything associated with the property. So you're just dealing directly with the landlord. You don't have to worry about kind of mortgage requirements and the hoops that they would ask you to jump through in terms of how the property is being let and managed. So that just makes it a little bit more of a simpler kind of deal and a simpler agreement to kind of set up and structure. And certainly if you're dealing with landlords that are tired landlords, they've been in the game for a while, they've owned the property for a number of years, and it just needs a bit of kind of TLC to bring it around to kind of make it work to its best potential, then a lot of these deals will have already been set up as HMOs, and they will have already been kind of structured in a way that allows them to operate as a business once they're, I suppose, tweaked and changed just to kind of perform a little bit better, as well as typically not having mortgages on the property because the landlords would have owned them for a long period of time as well. Now it's important to understand kind of where the money is in this kind of strategy and how you're going to make your profit really. So that's what we'll touch on next. So your profit really with this strategy lies in being able to, as you said, successfully manage the multiple tenants in the property. And your margin is going to be the difference between what you pay the landlord, any running costs of the property, and then the total rental income that you're going to be receiving on the property as well. So here the key really is to keep your costs and your voids down, and then you can really make a success of this strategy with not too much kind of starting capital. You'll typically have lower risks than when you start maybe to buy a property outright if you were kind of taking full ownership of it. And that's because if it's not working, you can simply agree with the landlord to end the agreement and hand the property back in a good condition, and you don't have to worry about then kind of large deposits that you would usually have to associate with buying the property. And then if you did make a mistake, it was maybe in the wrong area, you weren't generating the interest from the tenants that you'd hoped for. It's just really a simpler, or it's certainly a good way of testing the market and trying to I suppose get involved in HMOs if that's the route that you're looking to go down and you want to do it as a cash flow strategy, but you don't necessarily have the funds to buy the properties outright. Now the downside to this strategy is that you won't actually own the property, so you won't benefit from any potential capital growth or equity. You're simply going to be earning from the rental income. Now in terms of actually getting started in this types of strategy and these types of deals, in terms of starting capital, most of the properties that I've actually done on these agreements, the landlords have never actually asked for upfront deposits from myself in terms of setting up the agreements or setting up the deal, because the tenants coming into the property would be paying deposits. The properties have been provided furnished on a majority of occasions, although sometimes it's not to the best standards, so we have had to often ask for the landlords to remove certain furniture, especially if it's really dated or doesn't kind of have any let's say matching style to the rooms. Then it makes sense to have a budget aside to cover refurbishing costs really for the rooms, to get it looking how you want it and how it's going to sell best to the tenants in the area. And they've also been or been flexible on giving us access to the property to start viewings before the agreement even starts. So for the lease to let properties that we've done, we typically start out and target around the net cash flow of a minimum of £400 per month, with a start-up fund of about £2,000 to cover the first month's rent, a small refurb and furnishings. And that's kind of the lower end of the market. So these are deals where there's not many, or certainly not much work required to the property. There are also deals that are kind of structured already pretty well as a HMO in terms of the location, the setup, the licensing requirements and such. There are landlords that I know that use this strategy that target a minimum of £1,000 per month net income and net cash flow, and that's great. And you can certainly use this strategy to achieve returns like that, but you would have to be looking at maybe larger type properties, or you'll be looking at properties where you're going to have to do a heck of a lot of work in the beginning to get it ready as a HMO in order to benefit from that extra cash flow, because you're taking on the majority of the risk, the majority of the work, so there's going to be a higher reward. So it's just a case of having a balance, seeing which works for you, but just as a kind of a starting point, typically we would look at those figures to give you a bit of an example. But remember, everything's negotiable. It's a case of finding the deals that offer the best returns, that fit for you, and that don't require kind of a great startup capital. That's the whole point of using this strategy, because it is really ideally as a cash flow strategy, and to earn the income from it as almost like a rental business. Okay, so next we're going to look at the situation that this kind of strategy is best for, really. And I'd say it's probably more suited to people that are cash poor and time rich. And when I say kind of cash poor, I don't mean you kind of completely strapped. You do need to have some budget, because it's going to be a a little bit intensive at the beginning stages just to get the property up and running and to kind of weather any potential void periods, but it's not going to be a great deal. It's certainly a heck of a lot cheaper than deposits to buy the properties outright, and it's just really a case of having some kind of stability there to make sure that you can develop the strategy and systemize it and grow if you wanted to do that. But certainly it's suitable for somebody that's got a lot of time, because it's not a set and forget it strategy, and I'd strongly advise that you should have ideally some experience of managing tenants before you jump straight into it, because to manage a HMO with no previous experience with tenants can be quite daunting, but the rewards are great as well. So it's a case of balancing it and seeing which is going to be the best strategy for you. As I said, so the rewards are going to be really good with this type of strategy. The startup money that you need is going to be much lower than buying a HMO outright, and there's plenty of potential properties available as well, depending on kind of the locations and the areas that you're targeting. Now, it's also worth kind of considering that there are lots of landlords sick of managing kind of their own properties over a long period of time. So if they've been a landlord for 10, 15, 20 years, and typically been quite an old school landlord where they've done a lot of the managing themselves, it's easy to see how they can kind of get frustrated over a period of time with dealing with the ongoing kind of managements required. So it's a case of targeting ideally these types of properties, and if you can find kind of the market, and we'll discuss a number of strategies on how to find these types of deals in the rest of your training as well, then there's always going to be a supply of these types of deals to grow and develop this strategy. So let's look at what sort of assets are going to help you if this is your kind of main strategy that you're wanting to run with. So as we mentioned, ideally previous tenant experience is certainly going to help you. A thick skin when dealing with tenants. It's not usually a strategy that you can certainly set up in the early days and outsource and bring a letting agent on board to do all of the work, because that's in theory what your role is going to be. That's where you make your margin. You'll make your money on the kind of the difference, as we said, between your costs and what the rental income you're going to get. And if you're paying out to a letting agent to manage the property, then it's going to be very slim, and you're going to be taking on a lot of risk, and it's not really worth kind of the effort for that. Certainly, as you get a few more deals, you can systemize it by developing your own team, setting up your own agency maybe, and having your own kind of staff managing those properties. But you're going to be hands-on really in the early days of getting this up and running. So you're going to need the time as well to source these types of properties, to negotiate the deals, and then to manage the properties as well, through to getting them ready and putting the tenants in, and then managing those tenants throughout their agreements. In terms of time frames, it's a very quick kind of strategy compared to, as I said, buying a HMO kind of outright, because you've not got the normal purchase process that goes along with it. So it's a case of the longest time involved in this particular strategy is typically the actual timeline of finding the landlord, setting up the agreement, and then structuring a date really to take over the but once you have that up and running, then the rest of the process can be quite quick. Once you've got your agreement ready, and as I said, remember it's good to use a solicitor for your agreement to make sure it's kind of set up and structured correctly with the requirements for yourself and also for the landlord. But finding the actual landlords can be quite quick, as you're looking for properties, as I said, that are offered to let, and maybe have a tired landlord that's struggling to let the property already in today's market. Now you might have to invest some time in order to kind of get the property decorated and ready to let, and just improving the furnishings and making it a more appealing property so that you can turn it around from, as I said, an underperforming property to one that attracts tenants and one that rents quickly and has low void periods. But certainly within a time frame of around a month, you should be able to find the property and get something up and running quite quickly. Now we're next going to look at a bit of an example to give you an idea of how the figures work really, in terms of what the potential returns are and just how it breaks down and works out. So in this example we're going to assume again some kind of costs really. So there's a total investment that we're going to kind of recommend of about £650 for this example to cover your first month's rent, £1,000 to cover the costs of furnishings, and about £350 for any kind of general decorating. So that's about a £2,000 budget. And as I said, it's not the example that we've kind of discussed throughout this particular strategy is not something that requires a great deal of turnaround. It's not a large property, so your monthly costs for the rent side of it aren't going to be too high. But the flip side to that is as well the net kind of target income that you're going to be getting from the property is 400 plus kind of per month that we look to target, and you can increase that figure. As I said, you can go 5, 6, 700 up to around 1,000. The other assumption that we're going to make, or breakdown we're going to use in this example, is that for other letting costs, we're going to typically look at around 3 months rental income to cover things like internal maintenance, void periods, arrears, and utility bills as well. And this will just help to show you in the example really where the costs are associated. Now you might notice that this is lower than the example that we showed in the previous training video, where we just looked at buying HMO properties and the running costs for them. And the reason for that is because this particular strategy relies on self-management. So managing the property yourself, being active in keeping the costs down, whether that's utility bills or void periods or arrears, and also obviously no management costs, and because that's where as I said, your money's going to lie. Your money's going to be in the margin and the difference between your kind of costs and your income on this particular property, and it's more of a management kind of business strategy really, or a long-term kind of property business strategy. So when it comes to showing you the example, I'm going to just keep some of the figures on the screen as they come up in a second, just for you to have a bit of a look at and have a run through, and then we'll cover them in a second and just run through the detail. Okay, so as you can see in this example, you've got a total investment of 2,000. Your gross rental income on the property is going to be 16,000, and that's based on kind of the figures that we mentioned earlier, which is where you've got a 4-bedroom property that's bringing in a rental income of £80 per week, and then that works out at the figure here, as you can see, for your gross potential rental income of the property over a year period. So your lease payment to the landlord is going to be 7,800. Your other letting costs that we mentioned in terms of generally running the property with utility bills, void periods, and the rest of it. So your total costs for the property here are going to be 11,960. So your net rental income is just under 5,000, and your net return on investment is pretty high, as you can see here. And that's purely because the level of investment that you're putting into the deal is quite minimal, but it's really more of a kind of time strategy. Now, if you've just got one property running this strategy, an income of 5,000 or just under 5,000 isn't really going to make you rich anytime soon. It's a case of having to develop and build out this strategy and do a number of properties. If you set the systems up right, you can streamline it. It's a case of having maybe your own letting agent in the future, or setting up your own systems in place to manage those tenants and keep those costs down so you can continue to make an income from it. But simply put, as we said, it's really a kind of a low cost entry strategy, so it's not going to cost you a great deal to get started, but it allows you to build up potentially a good flow of deals and a good potential long-term cash flow. So just as a recap, you can see that with this strategy you're going to earn back your initial investment very quickly. If you've got a couple of properties in the same area, it's easy to build economies of scale for the management as well. The downside though is it can often be seen as just taking on a property job really, because it's difficult to, I suppose, see it as a potential portfolio building strategy. Now, although one of the hidden benefits is actually of this method is that you'll be the first in line to be direct with motivated landlords, but not all of them will want to sell there and then. They may want to sell in the future. So it's a kind of a waiting game. If your strategy is to build up a property portfolio, then over the long term you can certainly pick up some good deals this way. But when you're setting out, it's simply a case of, as we touched on before, really, it's an income generating strategy, but some people can see it as taking on a property job. So it's a case of balancing out where your skills are, what your situation is in terms of the money you've got to kind of get started, and which kind of strategies you'd prefer to do really. So to give you a bit of an idea, here's a breakdown really again of a case study that we've done on a property previously that we've used a lease to let strategy with that's not gone very well, made a couple of mistakes, and I'll run through those mistakes and show you them in this example, so you can hopefully avoid them, and then we'll look at a case study where it's gone right and where you've done well with it. So To give you a bit of an idea, one of the first properties I took on as a lease to let strategy was a really good four-bedroom property. It was actually above a restaurant, and it was in good condition already, fully furnished, in a great location, and all looked good. Until we actually took the keys and started the viewings, and at which point we'd actually just kind of signed the agreement. Now the property let quickly, and the first tenant moved in very shortly after, but within about probably an hour of them kind of moving into the property, we had a phone call saying that the boiler wasn't working. Um, Now the problem was with this particular agreement, we covered all internal maintenance, and as you guessed it, this also included the boiler. And we sent an engineer around. There was a major part, unfortunately, that was broken on the boiler. Cost of part and the labour wasn't worth repairing it, so it was a case of having to stump up for a new boiler. Now the ink wasn't even dry on this particular contract. It had been less than 24 hours since we'd actually got our first agreement growing, and we'd already been stung with a big maintenance bill that we had to foot because that's how we'd kind of structured the agreement. It wasn't something that we thought of or potentially was going to be an issue. Everything seemed fine at the early days. We'd had a couple of weeks to find tenants before the tenants even or before we'd even started the agreement, so the tenants moved in straight after, and it was just kind of bad timing, really. But luckily, on this particular situation, we explained to the landlord kind of what happened, and they agreed to split the bill with us. And maybe from a moral perspective, he kind of should have, because the boiler wasn't working, as we said, when we kind of took over. But from the actual agreement, we kind of agreed to cover the internal maintenance costs, and that included the boiler from the time that we signed the agreement. So that's just something we had to kind of chalk up to experience. And as I said, lucky for us, he did agree to pay for it towards the bill. So to his credit, I'm glad that he did. It helped us a little bit with our kind of budgets and stuff. And we had a 5-year agreement on this particular lease, so we were still happy to go ahead with it and go and keep the agreement going, really. Because otherwise, as I said, the property was in great condition, and it's in a fantastic location, and long term it was going to work out well. Now this is a very quick lesson that we learned on this one, trial by fire really, and then we made sure, certainly straight after that, all of our future agreements were going to have a period of time really for the landlord to be responsible for things like the boiler and the electrics. So typically now we set a date of around 3 months from when we start the agreement. Even if we're covering the costs of those items throughout the rest of the maintenance kind of or the rest of the contract, for the first 3 months the landlord would kind of fit the bill and cover the cost totally, because a large maintenance bill early on in the agreement could really wipe out a good few months' profit. And when you're not getting the added benefit of adding value to the property, you want to keep your maintenance bills low. You don't want to be pumping in a load of money in terms of improving the property going to be long term, because you won't necessarily experience the benefit from it. So as I said, it's just a kind of a bit of an example on how to improve it now, or how to improve that strategy. Now the top 3 things I'd probably do differently, or we do differently now on the deals that we do, is the first thing is to get the landlord to cover the costs of large items. So this includes things like external maintenance, so roofing, brickwork, sewerage, things like that, because these are quite unexpected, and if they do crop up, again, as I said, they'll wipe out any kind of budget quite quickly, really. Also, we'd look to kind of take things, or not to take things at kind of face value. We'd always now assume a bit of a contingency budget when we're starting off a new deal, just in case there's areas that we weren't aware of or sure of when we kind of first took on the property that may crop up and cost us a little bit at the end, really. So having a contingency budget is a safe bet for any deal that you're kind of looking at. And then the third thing is to negotiate the terms of the agreement to give us time to start the viewings like we did on this particular deal, and line up the tenants before the agreements start, so that you're paying the rent and the management payments to the landlord when you're getting income coming in from the property. As I said, on this particular property we had tenants ready to kind of go straight away, but it's not always the case. Sometimes you have to kind of negotiate that and come to an agreement on it. But these are 3 things I'd certainly kind of recommend to consider if you're looking at this strategy. Okay, so now we're going to look at a strategy of or a case study, sorry, of where this strategy can go right. So one of my lease to lets that we currently have is in an area of quite a traditional sort of family rental location, really. But the reason why it works so well is because it's a short distance to the Metro Link and to the Trafford Centre in Manchester. So it's quite a good location to live and to kind of, if you're working in the local areas, especially. And it's also close to some large local industrial areas. So the demand from professional tenants and blue collar work is really high. Now, for this particular property, the standard market rent to a family is about £525 per month. And when we kind of first came across the deal, as the property again was in a great condition, it was ready to let straight away. It's actually just had a full refurb carried out by the owner. We agreed to pay the full market rent on this one. We didn't negotiate on it because we saw there was still a margin in it and it still could work very well. Now again, you could have said that we should have kind of negotiated or maybe tried to get a lower price on it, but for us, we were looking at kind of the long-term potential for it, and we managed to negotiate a 5-year lease on the property with no rent increases. So the price that we were paying at the beginning was going to be the same in, say, 5 years' time. And we were able to start viewings before the first payment kind of started. So we had a warranty on the boiler as well, which allowed us to cover any kind of major maintenance costs for it. So we certainly learned a lesson there from last time. So although we didn't negotiate on the original cost per month, we did negotiate on the other items in terms of the length of the agreement, no rent increases, time to start viewings before the agreement started, and the maintenance warranty on the boiler. Then we also decided to put in slightly higher quality furnishings than the standard and the competition for the local area, because we wanted it to stand out than the other lets. The property was already in a great condition, as we said, so it just needed a few tweaks kind of here and there to make it kind of stand out, really. We also provided a communal cleaner for the property because we wanted the tenants to have more of a fully serviced accommodation, really, as well as the usual kind of bits and pieces and costs that we'd include in the property as well. And then the upshot for that is that the property let very quickly. Now, out of all the properties that we have that we run this kind of strategy on, it continues to be the one with the most long-term tenants in there. The property rents per room at £80 per week, and because of the low maintenance costs, due to the condition the property was in when we took it over, and because of the long-term tenants, the property is our best performing lease to let property to date. It generates around sort of 500 to 600 per month net income on a 4-bedroom property, as you said. Not much costs and not a great deal of work goes into it in terms of maintaining it and ticking it over because of the type of deal it was in the first place. So hopefully you can see there, you don't necessarily have to have massive properties in order to make this work in terms of sort of 6, 7, 8 bedroom type houses. You can certainly make more margins on those types of deals, but even if you're starting at this kind of smaller end of the market, you can still kind of make a margin on the right properties, and it's just a case of doing that due diligence and making sure you pick the right properties from the start, really. So hopefully you found that introduction to lease to let helpful. As we said kind of throughout this video, it's not really a strategy to do unless you've got the time and the ability and ideally some experience with dealing with tenants, but although it's not a necessity, certainly the time and the ability and the people skills and the patience to deal with tenants will help you and go a long way. So hopefully you found that video helpful, and I look forward to catching up with you in the next topic.